So let me talk just for a few minutes about those first few days of the heavens and the earth. Day one, God made the heavens and the earth, and he made light. He made space, the fabric of space, whatever the fabric is in his concept. We don't really know what the fabric of space is made out of, but it is intimately connected with time and energy. You must have both time and space at the same time, the same moment. And this is, again, in the beginning of time. God is separate from time, separate from the creation, but he is the source of all creation. So he created time, space, and he created energy. And then using those as a background, God can still, ex nihilo, from nothing, create the elements, as in the periodic table, certainly create compounds from those elements, and he created a world that was covered with water. And so this points out that there's actually a suite of natural laws of general revelation, as we just sort of look at the revelation that God gave in the history of the early history of the world. Before that even comes to be, there are things like laws of logic that have to be in place. Laws of non-contradiction. A statement that's asserted can't be both true and false at the same time. There are laws of mathematics, so that the world can be described in very precise mathematical descriptions and manipulated according to mathematical laws and reasoning. There are laws of physics, laws of light, of gravity and motion, and of course our favorite, the laws of thermodynamics, are laws that describe how the world works in ways that we can see and understand and evaluate mathematically, of course. Then there are the laws of chemistry. These are the laws of the action of atoms that react with one another, that conserve their mass. And many of these are laws of conservation. That is, you start with a certain amount of energy that can neither be destroyed nor recreated, only conserved, with some lost due to entropy. And so these laws had to pre-exist the creation. These laws of biology are laws that God caused to be because of his origin, his ability to create the universe. These laws of populations and genetics, like the laws of heredity, exist. And you look at those laws and you say, where did they come from? And it turns out that really these all come from intelligence, not materialism, not simple nuts and bolts, sticks and stones, rocks and hills don't originate laws that the creation follows. These laws of physics and chemistry and biology are pervasive in the entire universe, and they all originate in an intelligence. So a tapestry of laws that are just right for life, and these laws define how God has created the universe in just the right way for the life type that we are. Hebrews 1 says, God has spoken to us in his Son, through whom also he made the world, and he upholds all things by the word of his power. So his Son, the Lord Jesus, is the maker, the creator. And although he's finished creating at this point, he's still intimately involved in upholding all things in the universe by the word of his power. And these laws are his fingerprints. The laws come from God, and Jesus is the one who continually upholds the universe. Now, there were building blocks made at the beginning. These are atoms, and we can see atoms when there are enough of them, but largely they are invisible, and everything that is visible to us is made of them. You have enough of them and they come together and you can actually see that this is a wooden podium. They combine in millions of ways to make things like coal or diamonds, leaves on trees, skin and water. Life is simply impossible without the properties of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, maybe phosphorus, maybe sulfur as well. Maybe you can make the argument that many of the atoms are just the way they need to be for life to exist, just as water is the way it is that allows our life to exist. And they certainly are invisible. And what is visible to us are the field properties of aggregate groups of atoms. There's about 90 atoms plus artificial atoms that we've been able to make by banging one atom against another. So the periodic table has more than 90 atoms in it. So Colossians 1:16 says, "For by him all things were created, both in the heavens and on the earth, visible and invisible. All things have been created through him and for him." Pretty definitive statement about the Lord Jesus being the creator, things that we can see, things that we can't see. The fact that although the atom is mostly empty space, we perceive aggregates of atom as solid substances. Again, it's based on God forming a world that's just right for our type of life. God made atoms, and he made the earth with us in his mind, with us as the inheritor of a place to live that is habitable. So our earth is ideally placed in the Milky Way galaxy off one of the spiral arms so that we can view the rest of the cosmos fairly clearly, so we can get an idea of where we actually are in the universe. Our Earth is the right distance from the sun, which isn't made until day 4, but it also exhibits a 23.5 degree tilt so that there are moderate temperatures in the zones above and below the equator periodically during the year. It has enough gravity to retain oxygen and carbon dioxide, all the gases that we need for our sustenance. We are intimately dependent on these factors like carbon dioxide and oxygen for our livelihood and just in being. And there's a magnetic shield around the Earth, as you see down here to the right on the bottom, that protects us from coronal mass ejections from the sun. So periodically the sun throws out millions, if not billions, of tons that are moving millions of miles an hour that take a few days to reach us from the sun. And they are major ejections of plasma-like mass that when they impact our coronal shield, our magnetic shield, they are deflected to the poles. And this is where the aurora borealis comes in, the northern and southern lights. And if these also have the potential for screwing up our electronic communications as well. But by and large, our planet is habitable because it has an iron core that's moving, creating an electric current that creates a huge magnetic shield around our planet. Our planet is actually very intimately designed so that we can live and have our being in it. Isaiah 45:18 says, "He is the God who formed the earth and made it. He established it and did not create it a waste place, but formed it to be inhabited." And this is one of the reasons that I'm not a gap theorist. The gap theorists like to say that God created the first creation as a waste place that had to be corrected. But this simply says he did not create a waste place. He formed our world to be inhabited by us. God has handcrafted the universe to be inhabited just by beings just like us. And that's called the anthropomorphic argument. It also is a place where God could dwell in relationship with man. Think about that. God wanted to make man, but he had to first make the infrastructure so that man could survive, and it could survive in a place where God could dwell in a particular kind of relationship with man. So if we look at going out away from our home in outer space, we understand that it is with great effort that we take with us the things that we need. Take with us oxygen, carbon dioxide, nitrogen. Take with us warm temperatures. Take with us even atmospheric pressure within the suit and prevent us from venting all those things out into space and dying of suffocation in a suit. And we also see that during you're in a microgravity environment in space, there's loss of bone tissue, there's loss of bone calcium, and that creates fragile bones. And over a long period of time, that can be a real problem for going into a place where gravity exists, like back on Earth. You can be very weak and your bones can become very brittle. That's one of the problems with space travel. And it just points out that our physiologic needs, whatever they are, and in whatever they are in their different variety, are met precisely by earth. Food and water, met precisely by what we can gain from the earth. And God said, let there be light. And there was light. He just simply had to say. He's talking here most likely about visible light. God said, let there be a light source. Again, this is before there was a permanent light source in heavens of the sun. And so this may have been just a temporary light source that was localized within God or localized from someplace outside of the earth, so that in relation to which there can be night and day cycles. And so there was evening and there was morning one day. And I've made evening and morning and one day in red here because it simply points out that these are characteristics of the use of the word day that constrain it to a 24-hour meaning. And so evening and morning and using a numeral for the day constrain the word day to a 24-hour time period. And that there are other ways of looking at that as well, but these are sufficient to show that the day was a 24-hour day in Genesis 1, verse 5. In day 2, God created what's called the expanse, and this may have been a space between the oceans and a vapor canopy that surrounded the earth. Now, some people have taken issue with the vapor canopy theory and have another alternative explanation, is that there were waters below in the ocean and that the waters above were moved out as interstellar water, as God stretched out the heavens. There are multiple places in Jeremiah and Psalms and other books where it speaks of God stretching out the heavens, physically stretching it out. And what may have been on the leading edge of that is some of this originally created water. So two potential understandings of the expanse. Genesis 1:17 says, the moon and the stars were placed in the expanse of the heaven, which suggests that the expanse really was an interstellar space, not just a space between the earth and a vapor canopy. And God called the expanse heaven, and there was evening and morning a second day. And so those, again, constrain day 2 to a 24-hour day. Day 3 is the time when dry land appears and the first life is created. This is plant life. So there was a single supercontinent, people believe. Rodinia is one name that's suggested for it. A single continent that may have begun as an underwater continent that became an above water as the continents were uplifted, and the deepening of the oceans caused water to flow quickly off of the continent. So dry land appeared, and God, as he said, created plant life as the first created life. And this plant life was fully formed and functional plant life. It was plants yielding seed after their kind, and it was good. And we see the use of the seed, the idea that within themselves, life has a way to propagate itself through genetic means. And that seed contains everything that's needed to propagate the species, or the kind, if you will. Now, kind doesn't mean species. It means probably a larger division, something like a family grouping in which genus and species were to develop by time and change, mutation, and natural selection. But they were made after their kind, which is a division that separates one kind of life from another, one type of bloodline from another. And God saw that the seed and their kind, in terms of plant life, was good. And there was evening and a morning, a third day. It was as God wished it to be on day 3. That first life, as I said, is complete, or was complete life. In other words, for a plant, up on the right, you see there's a plant cell wall that borders the cell. The cell is filled with chloroplasts. It has a nucleus. It has a central vacuole that contains gases for transmission and completion of photosynthesis. And photosynthetic machinery is green because they absorb blue and yellow light wavelengths and give off green. So green actually is not used in photosynthesis, even though it's readily available in the sun, from the sun. So these are biodegradable solar panels. You see on the bottom, taking in carbon dioxide and releasing oxygen and making sugars and energy, metabolic energy, from carbon dioxide and water. This is the intricate interconnection that we have with plants. We give them carbon dioxide, they give us oxygen and sugars as part of a food source. And so these constitute living machines that are able to capture light energy and transform it into ATP energy and carbon-type sugars while they produce oxygen, which gives us this yin and yang cycle of we give the plants carbon dioxide, they give us oxygen. And plants are primary producers. They're designed as food sources for other created creatures, including us. Some of you really like salads, I'm sure. This life could grow in the entire supercontinent because the entire world had a relatively constant temperature. And it was designed to propagate via seeds, and it was very good. And it contained within it the first genetic language. And I say first genetic language because there are actually several genetic languages. And that, again, is instance where God is leaving traces of himself in the physical world around us that we can see. And the place, besides just the overall structure of the cell, which is a non-random cellular type machine, that the place where this DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid, is found is in the nucleus. And these are the directions and information about how to make the plant cell, how to make the different levels of the plant cell in the cross-section as we have here of the leaf in the middle. And it's a marvel of information storage, condensation, retrieval, and miniaturization. If you took all the DNA of a human cell out and you stretched it out, it would be about 3 feet tall. And that is all compacted in a cell smaller than you can see. It's incredible in the miniaturization that we're talking about. And it's also incredible that it's the basis for millions and millions of cells in a single leaf. And that leaf structure is in a substructure of the larger structure of the plant, which contains a seed head or a flower that contains the seeds that are produced for propagation. DNA contains the genetic code for a very complex biochemistry of life and photosynthesis. There are light and dark reactions in photosynthesis, and the chemistry is very complex. And we're not going to go into the chemistry, but it is incredibly complex and non-random. It is something that doesn't occur by chance. If you take the characteristics of cells, the different lipid and carbon-containing macromolecules, put them all in a test tube, they don't spontaneously form into a living, propagating cell, and they certainly don't form into a plant cell, which has a cell wall. And so this kind of language directs the construction of plants that are non-random. It's coming from an intelligence. It doesn't come from time, chance, and random mutation. It comes from the DNA molecule. It's called the molecule of life, and this gives you an idea of this code, this primary code of T bonding with A and C bonding with G in a ladder-like system that is alpha helically wound up. And when it's wound against histone proteins, it can condense into chromosomes that segregate at cell division, and that's the method of inheritance. But it also contains this genetic code of the letters taken 3 at a time. For instance, GCA on the left here is the abbreviation in the genetic code in the DNA for what will become alanine in a protein. And AGA, the next one, is arginine. And GAT, the next one, is asparagine. And so you have these different amino acids that are coded for by the linear sequence of bases on the DNA molecule as the first language. And then there's this second language of transfer RNAs that bring RNAs to make RNA templates off the DNA. There's another language of methylation of the DNA that helps open and regulate the DNA at different points at different times. But it is fundamentally a language. So we have in our culture, we have Morse code, which you may be familiar with. They have three elements: a dot, a dash, and a space are the three elements of Morse code, which, when taken together like three dots, indicate the letter S is being transmitted. And there are 26 letters in our alphabet, can make 400,000 or so words. Those words can then be combined into sentences to create information that's passed on. So Morse code is a language with its own sorts of constraints. Well, the language of DNA is similar. So we have in the nucleotides those four nucleotides, G, A, T, and C, that combine with each other, and their sequence of which, taken three at a time, indicates one of 20 amino acids that are required for building proteins. Proteins do most of the work in cells. It's hard, you can't have a living cell without proteins. And they make thousands of different kinds of proteins in a single cell, and thousands of different kinds of living cells. And so the language is used as you go up the line to make more and more complex structures. Although DNA is horribly complex just as it is, it's used to make bigger level structures as we go upward. So here's, let's say, some of these primary elements, these letters that we talked about. So they're randomly around in a cell. This is a bacterial cell, and if they sort of randomly come together, you don't really get intelligible sentences. You don't really get intelligible comments until you get to this point, where the letters are all in sequence. Mycoplasma, which is this kind of bacteria, contains 580,000 letters of DNA, and they have to be ordered in a specific way to contain information that's needed to control the functions of the bacterium. And that's true of other living cells as well. And so if you go back, anything that's less than that doesn't give you the control that you need. So there has to be this ordered sequence that is the synonymous with the actual content of information. And random movements of these elements, these language elements, don't produce what coded sequences do code for, and that's real information. So language is a property of intelligence. So the atheistic worldview, the worldview of spontaneous creation, of evolution, says that we start out at the bottom with nothing, and nothing somehow became something. No one knows exactly how. That something that was dead stuff suddenly somehow, way in the past, billions of years ago, became living stuff and developed DNA. And that DNA was then passed down through normal generation to everything that's alive. And so everything that's alive was made through naturalistic type processes, and that the properties of matter and energy that we talked about at the beginning that God created are then responsible for making both the DNA and its information. And that is a key distinction in your mind. DNA is not just low entropy, a low entropy state, an ordered state. It's a state that has coded information in it. And so this is a troublesome prediction for those who would hold to the evolutionary line of thinking. The question then that arises is, did the properties of the ink and the paper write the book? Right? So here we have a book. It's filled with ink and on pages. Did the ink and the paper write the content of the book? And we know, of course, that is impossible. Random processes do not produce information. And information in this way is a real stumbling block to any evolutionary type explanation for how the world came to be. So on day 3, supercontinent with plants yielding seed after their kind. There was evening and there was morning the 3rd day. Now, in order to fuel plants and fuel the rest of what would become the food chain, there has to be a permanent source of light, and God created that on the next day. A permanent source of light and warmth for the earth, 27 million degrees Fahrenheit at its core. My goodness. The closest we can get to the sun is a bolt of lightning, the hot plasma that's created by a bolt of lightning, very transiently on the earth. But the sun has hydrogen fusing to helium, giving off massive amounts of energy, using billions of tons a second of fusion to create the light that is emitted from the sun. The purpose of the sun, God says, is to mark the seasons, the days, and the year. Of course, we know the seasons as we go around the sun once. The Earth moves around the sun once in a year time frame, and the 23.5 degree tilt creates the seasons, and it also creates that 1 year in orbit. So this has a cosmic derivation, as do days, and a day is a single rotation of the Earth in reference to the sun. So there's a cosmic derivation of what the sun's purposes are, to mark the seasons, the day, and the years. There's a staggering amount of energy that's used every second from fusion reactions to create the energy that we see emitted from the sun. And if we look at the galaxy as a whole, we see there's an estimate of 100 billion stars in just our own galaxy. And there are maybe 100 billion galaxies as far as we can see. 100 billion times 100 billion is a lot of stars. In other words, it's a lot of power. The sun also has about a 4-year lifespan. At its typical burning rate, as we can determine it right now, we have 4 billion years before it burns out. But it will burn out should the Lord not come in the interim. 4 billion years is our time frame. The sun is not to be worshipped. You see Egypt and other cultures where they worship the sun as life-giving. Well, they were right that it was life-giving, but they were wrong to worship it. And so day 4, the moon was created rather than at day 1, probably to give an opportunity for people to be sure that they don't worship the sun. It wasn't the first thing created. It also brings to mind the idea that our Creator has unlimited power. God has all the power in all the suns, in all the universes, the universe, and all the galaxies of the universe, all at the same time. And he's the originator of all energy. The moon, as a combination with the Earth, marks the demarcation of a month. You can see the shadow of the Earth as it falls upon the moon, changing geometrically as the Earth and the sun move about in phases. So the moon also has a celestial function, celestial origin for 28 days marking a month. The moon produces tides by using its gravitational field to pull on the side of the Earth, and as the Earth rotates, the tides change, and the moon, of course, rotates around the Earth in lockstep. We always see only one side of the moon because it's in a gravitational lock. But the moon creates gravitational pulls, and the tides replenish the estuaries at the edges of continents and are very important for life. And he made the stars also. And there was evening and there was morning, a fourth day. So all those billions of stars made by God with all the energy that they contain, a tiny, tiny fraction of that reaches our world. From our own sun, just a tiny fraction reaches our location and is made useful by photosynthesis in the food chain and ultimately for our own sustenance. Then we come to day 5. There were aquatic creatures and birds created on day 5. There was this second creation of life. The ocean creatures were created after their kind, as well as every kind of bird. Again, not species. We're not talking about species level. We're talking about multiple kinds independently created here. So we're not talking about creation of life once and then just natural dispersion and differentiation through evolutionary processes. We're talking about individual created kinds, of multiple kinds of animals, multiple kinds of birds, and their charge was to multiply and to fill the ocean and the land. And there was evening and morning. There was a 5th day. On the 6th day, God created the cattle and creeping things and men and women, mankind, created from the earth after their own kind, their own bloodline. They were created for us to rule, so people were given rule over other created kinds, and we should, as good stewards, be good environmentalists too. In other words, looking to the best sorts of relationship with our natural world as with each other. We were to be fruitful and fill the earth and fellowship with God. That's ultimately our purpose. Multiply and fill the earth. The whole earth was given to us for space to populate. And then certainly our main function to fellowship with God and to glorify God. And all fruit in terms of plants were given as food for us, so we can be vegetarians. And there's certainly a way to do that as long as you eat the correct foods. You get the right nutrients, the right amino acids. You can get those from plants as well as animal. But even though at this point animals were not given as food for human beings. And it was said that this relationship was very good. And these people also had long lifespans. And I think this really points out something fundamentally genetic about the creation, that people were designed to live about 1,000 years. So we see that Adam lived to 930 years, Seth 912. All these early individuals who are recorded in the scriptures lived about 1,000 years, except for Enoch, who God took. And I think that this speaks to what would God's original plan have been back if everything had gone well and there had been no fall, that Adam would have lived about 1,000 years, and God would have walked and talked with Adam and taught him and spent time with him and explained the creation and enjoyed each other for those 1,000 years. And I think at the end of that, God would have done what he did with Enoch. He would have simply translated him into his presence, and there would be no death. And Methuselah, 969, he died in the flood, as did Lamech, die in the flood. He only lived 770 years. Noah, again from pre-flood days, lived 950 years. So the genetics of people prior to the flood were very pristine. There was very low genetic mutations, if any, and that way they could interbreed freely with close relatives as well and have no genetic consequences to that, and their lifespan was very long. I think of this in terms of what we know about the human genome, that only about 10 to 20% of the human genome is actually expressed. Well, the other 80% is regulatory, and those regulatory genes may have been involved in maintaining your body for 1,000 years. Because if it's not used today, and our lifespan has come down from, as you see, from Shem at 600 to Abraham at 175 to where we are, which is less than 100. We think we're doing well if we get to 100, maybe 110, but people lived far longer in the past than we do today, and that's because of genetic load that we carry. This looks at a plot of the centuries that people lived after Noah, after the time of Noah. And if you plot this, going from about 700 years down to, I think this is Jesus, 33 years, you get a biological decay curve. This is actually fairly advanced mathematics. That is the numbers that we find in the Bible after the flood of Shem and his descendants, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, their descendants. Their lifespans went down according to a biological principle of decay, with a correlation coefficient of about 90%, which is pretty good. These spots, these data points correlated about 90% correlation with the line that's drawn. And this says that this process is actually biological in its derivation. Now, the evolutionary tree says something different. It says all life started out as a single entity, maybe once. All life came to be suddenly, and then came to differentiate and to diverge over time to become all the different types of organisms, including human beings. Well, the creation concept is that one of an orchard, of having individual creation events followed with sort of a derivation, just like you see in evolution. You actually have creation followed by a type of evolution for diversification into genus and species level. And that we see is what happens after creation. So creation finished on day 6, and there was a day 7. God was resting. He chose to rest on day 7. He ceased creating, but he continues to uphold his creation. And he had fellowship, of course, with Adam and Eve. And he used this pattern of 7-day as a pattern for the work week. There's no natural parallel in the natural world for 7 days as a work week. It was a non-natural pattern that God gave in the sequence and order and days, 7 days of creation. And you find that in Deuteronomy chapter 5 and Exodus chapter 35, that we were to work for 6 days and rest on the seventh. And there is certainly a conflict from the evolutionary interpretation to the creation interpretation, that the stars were not made on the third day. The stars were made billions and billions of years ago, and that the water that covered the earth was primordial, as opposed to sometime the earth forming much later in the evolutionary sequence, when a star aggregated, and there's aggregation, there was the earth forming, and then millions of years later the first oceans came to be. So there's a definite sequence disparity in the sequence from the evolutionary perspective and the Christian perspective of special creation. So we have one on the left going from nothing into something and creating everything over time, to the special creation model of God creating all life that ends up being judged by the fall. So the creation model, the special creation model, is found in Genesis, is, as we've said, a historical account, comes from a plain reading of the text, has the genealogies that suggest that the earth is very young, the special creation individually of plants, animals, and people, and a historical, literal, or plain grammatical understanding of the scriptures are its basis.